President. And may I start my contribution to this debate in recognising that I do think respect Senator Waters as a very intelligent senator and contributor to this place, and I'm sure she's a very well-read senator and considers these matters, I know, very deeply. But so I was surprised in her contribution then, because I'm sure she would be aware that basically no respected economist, not Treasury, not Productivity Commission, no government agency in this country considers the diesel fuel tax rebate arrangements a subsidy. None of them. None of them define it as a subsidy for the mining industry, and I'll go through the reasons for that later. But I would have thought an intelligent and well-read senator like Senator Waters would, one, know that, and two, if she is arguing a different position to Treasury, to the Productivity Commission, to almost every economist that I've known in respected circles in this place, that she would deal with those issues. She would have raised them and rebutted them and pointed out why all of these eminent public sector agencies were wrong and the Greens were right. But we've just heard throughout that whole speech not a mention, not even an engagement on that side of the debate. Instead, unfortunately, we did have a contribution that was full of vitriol, it was full of denigrating a former Prime Minister, it was full of attacks on particular wealthy mining investors, and it was full of emotion about free tax breaks to rich people and all these conspiracy theories that the Greens like to meddle in. And that is unfortunate, because I do believe the Greens have a higher intelligence than that, and they don't need to resort to the lowest common denominator in these types of debates. But it is unfortunate they're not engaging with the real issues on this particular matter, and they're certainly not even trying to rebut, not even trying to put forward an alternative argument to these respected institutions that I'll quote from in my contribution. So I think it's important, Madam Acting Deputy President, that when we're discussing any change to a particular tax or rebate, that we do properly understand the history and reasons behind the tax arrangements we have. Now, the diesel fuel tax rebate system was first established in the 1920s. Sorry, I should say, I'll correct myself. The fuel excise system was first established in the 1920s. And it was obviously established to support the funding of roads, to provide a regular revenue stream to fund new roads, and many countries have these types of arrangements. It was only until the 1950s it was actually extended to diesel at all. Previously it was only levied on petrol, obviously for mainly road vehicles, but in the 1950s it was extended to diesel. Now, in the 1950s the arrangements were that the mining sector itself did not pay the tax at all. There was no rebate. It just wasn't levied on the mining sector. I believe it was collected directly and levied directly at the retail fuel pump, which generally the mining sector wouldn't use. Now, later on, those arrangements were changed so that the excise does apply to all sales of fuel, both petrol and diesel. But a rebate is provided to those industries that do not use our roads. The reason, of course, that the mining sector was not levied, did not get levied the fuel excise, is because the excise was established to fund roads, to fund people who use roads. Of course, the mining sector, along with the agricultural sector, which also receives the rebate, they don't often use established roads. They have their vehicles and the diesel they use for equipment off-road on either roads that they build in their own mine sites or farms, or of course in the mining sector for equipment that actually does a lot of the digging and waste disposal that is required at a mine site. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable public policy rationale. We're setting up a system to fund roads, so of course we would charge road users to fund those investments. Mining sector, farmers are not using those roads, so we don't charge the tax to them. There's also a more technical economic argument as well about why we don't impose taxes on business inputs. It is commonly recognised that a tax on the inputs to business is a particularly distortionary one because it will change how businesses decide to allocate their capital, to employ labour, and cause inefficiency in the economy. It's why, for example, the GST is a value-added tax. We don't charge it on all transactions that occur in our economy. It is only actually levied on the value added of each individual sector of the economy, and that's how businesses get input tax credits. Now, if the Greens were being economically consistent here, they would also be saying that all of those input tax credits that exist through the GST system are also a subsidy to businesses, because it's exactly the same system that we use for the fuel tax rebate, that businesses that themselves buy particular products that GST is levied on get a rebate, get an input tax credit that they record on their business activity statement, and then reduce their GST payable accordingly for those business tax credits. It's exactly how the fuel tax rebate system works, and it works because that's a more efficient tax to fund it on the value added that each sector produces, not on the business inputs, because just taking the cream, taking the value added, won't distort those decision making, won't make businesses make massively different decisions and therefore by definition inefficient decisions. So that's why we have the system, and it's also of course why it's not a subsidy. It's not a subsidy because it's just simply a reflection of the fact that miners don't use roads, and that we don't, as a general rule across all our taxation arrangements, tax the inputs to business. And that's why, as I said at the introduction of my remarks, the Australian Treasury, the preeminent economic agency of our public sector, do not define the fuel tax credit system as a subsidy. In a 2011 submission to the G20 Energy Experts Group, Treasury stated that, and I'll quote directly, "Fuel tax credits are not a subsidy for fuel use, but a mechanism to reduce or remove the incidence of excise or duty levied on the fuel used by business off-road or in heavy on-road vehicles." That is pretty clear. Madam Acting Deputy President, it's pretty clear. And I again ask, apparently Senator Waters mentioned that there will be another Green senator contributing to the debate this morning, and in good faith, if they're serious about this, rather than just running a political campaign to bash the mining industry again, please explain and outline why you disagree with Treasury and why their particular and expert evidence there is wrong. I'd also add that each year Treasury compile what's called a tax expenditure statement. It's a summary of all the reductions in tax rates we provide to particular sectors and how much that costs the budget. So in that document, you'll see the cost of things from the superannuation guarantee right through to forestry managed investment schemes, different arrangements that the government has established to provide tax assistance or a tax credit to particular businesses through the economy. And I think it's very important to note, while that document's not per se about subsidies themselves, the Treasury don't include the fuel diesel tax rebate as part of their assessment. They could easily do that. The Greens have had it costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. It's not a difficult economic calculation. But Treasury don't do that because it's not a tax expenditure. It's not a reduction in tax. It's simply a historical reflection of the fact that we have not levied this tax on the mining sector or the agricultural sector. And likewise, another agency, the Productivity Commission, each year they do compile a report specifically on assistance measures to business, called the Trade and Assistance Review. It comes out every year, and once again, consistent with Treasury practice, the Productivity Commission do not measure or estimate the fuel tax rebate as a subsidy. They've had ample opportunity to do over many years, and indeed I asked them about this at Senate estimates this year, and they have made the judgment that this particular arrangement is not a subsidy, and therefore the Greens are completely acting against all of the expert economic advice in defining it as so. More generally too, in that report, in the Trade and Assistance Review that comes out every year, the Productivity Commission measures the assistance given to different sectors of our economy across the board. And it is very wide-ranging. It includes research and development funding, it includes the effective rate of assistance provided by tariffs, and well, we used to have quotas, we don't have them anymore, and it also covers other more general and specific business assistance provided to different industries. Now, one thing again the Greens don't engage in, I'm sure they've read this, I'm sure they've heard this evidence before, but they just simply ignore and don't seek to rebut at all, is that the Productivity Commission actually conclude that of all the sectors of our economy, the mining sector receives the fewest and the lowest rate of assistance from government. And remember that that assistance is very broad-ranging. It also includes generic R&D funding, and most of the mining sector's assistance, and I'll quote exactly the figures in a second, most of the mining sector's assistance is made up of that research and development funding that is available through R&D Start, through the R&D tax concessions that we have that have been a long-standing arrangement and of course are available to all businesses. They're not specific to any particular sector of the economy. So the PC said, and concluded, I think it's important to read out exactly what they said. They said that in their latest report that was released in June this year, the effective rate of assistance, net assistance per unit of value added, that is, was around 4% for the manufacturing sector, nearly 3% for the primary production sector, and less than 1% for mining. At the industry group level, which is a more disaggregated level, the highest measured effective rates of assistance continued to be for the motor vehicles and parts and the textiles, leather, clothing and footwear industry groups. So, and actually the Productivity Commission said in that quote that the assistance was less than 1% to the mining sector. The actual effective rate for the mining sector is 0.1%. 0.1% of their value added. That's the rate of assistance that the mining sector received from the government. And that's a figure you'll never hear the Greens quote, Madam Acting Deputy President. 0.1%. Just registerable in a tenth of a percent. And the other sectors, the manufacturing sector 4%, the primary production 3%, multiple times greater assistance than the mining sector receives. But that's not what the Greens quote. They ignore that. I'm not sure why. I wait to hear how the Productivity Commission has got this wrong. They've been doing this for nearly 40 years, I believe, these reports, but apparently they've got it wrong for that whole period. I wait, and I continue to wait for a Greens senator that is arguing for these particular policies, and they do that regularly, to engage in this debate and properly rebut that expert evidence from those organisations. Now, I noticed that Senator Waters did not quote from this time. I have heard in other debates in this context some Greens use an Australia Institute report that has been completely discredited, so at least Senator Waters did not go that far. We have established, though, that diesel fuel tax rebate is not a subsidy. But the Australia Institute compiled a report, I think it was last year, yes, it was sometime last year, which purported to show that the mining sector received $17.6 billion in subsidies a year, and that was made up partly by the diesel fuel tax rebate, which no one thinks is a subsidy except for the Greens and their supporters. But they also had some other things in this report as well, which are actually even more absurd, so that's perhaps why Senator Waters didn't mention it. I don't exactly know how the Australian Institute came to this, but in their $17.6 billion, they actually included the costs of providing subsidised passenger rail travel in Queensland. That costs $1.05 billion a year in Queensland. And they included that in their $17.6 billion figure. So they got lots of media, they got lots of stories. At the time this was released, the mining sector is receiving $17.6 billion, and various media outlets reported it without any questioning. Included in that figure was not just this diesel fuel tax rebate, which is a complete red herring as well. They also included $1 billion from subsidising passenger rail services in Queensland. How does that at all relate to the mining sector? How, Madam Acting President, could you actually seriously put forward that subsidising passenger rail services in Brisbane, because that's the only place that has passenger rail services in Queensland, gets $1 billion, and that's a subsidy of the mining sector? I don't know if the Australian Institute has been to any mines recently. None of them are in Brisbane. No mines are in Brisbane. They're all outside of Brisbane, and I don't think there are any TITO train-in, train-out mining workers in this country. I don't think there are. There are FIFO workers. There are DIDO workers, drive-in, drive-out. I don't think there are any TITO train-in, train-out workers. I don't think they exist. But again, if the Greens have evidence of these mine workers who put on their "Don't Kill Me" vests in the morning, wait for their train at the Yeronga Pilly station, and then at the end of it, pop off at the Caval Ridge mine near Moranbah Well, I didn't know that service existed. Maybe that accounts for some of the $1 billion that was provided, but I haven't heard of that before. They also included in these estimates another nearly $1 billion, $831 million was included to cover the costs of port services that various state governments own or provide, and some own rail services as well. There's a little bit more connected to the mining sector because these are actually services that mines use, unlike passenger rail services. Mines do use freight rail lines, certainly, and they do use ports to export their coal, but they included the total costs of providing those services in these subsidies. There's $831 million a year. Of course, I'm sure as an Australian student, again, Dr. Richard Dennis is a very intelligent person, I'm sure he would realise that actually state governments do charge for the mining sector to use those services. They charge them a fee to use a rail line, and they certainly charge them a price to use the port. Indeed, they're charging them such a price at the port at the moment that it's seriously hurting the mines at the moment because they signed many take-or-pay contracts a few years ago, and that's causing them quite a bit of grief. But nonetheless, the state government do very well out of those things. Now, if you were being serious, sure, include the $831 million, but on the other side of the ledger, you'd of course include the charges that the state government apply on the mining sector to use those services. Now, I'm actually not sure exactly how it works out, but generally all of these services are regulated by various state-based regulators like the Queensland Competition Authority in Queensland, and they do a calculation about what the appropriate charge should be. They look at the costs of providing those services, they include a rate of return for the government, and I don't actually think they're doing all that bad from them. I'm sure they're actually making money from the mining sector. So it's the opposite of a subsidy. They're actually making a return of it, but notwithstanding that, that was also included. Now, I should get off this because there's other things I want to say, but I'll say one more thing on this. This Australian Institute report, there was one other element they included. It was a smaller element, but Senator Nash would be, through you, Madam Deputy President, Senator Nash would be very familiar with the Royalties to Regions program in Western Australia, a very proud policy initiative of the WA Nationals Party, and that of course is levied, that comes from royalties, of course. 25% of royalties in Western Australia are reserved for these regional programs. The Australian Institute thought that spending on the Royalties for Regions program was a subsidy to the mining sector. It was actually funded by a tax applied on the mining sector. They pay royalties, of course, but they didn't include that tax in it. They included the payments made for these Royalties for Regions fund as part of that $17.6 billion. So, for example, Madam Acting Deputy President, I think Senator Nash would be interested to know that the Ord Stage 2, which the West Australian Government are funding at the moment, which is going towards expanding agriculture production, of course, is actually apparently a subsidy to the mining sector. I I don't quite see how that logic works, but again, as part of that $17.6 billion, payments, a funding of a expanded agriculture irrigation project is apparently a subsidy to the mining sector. It's amazing logic on the behalf of the Australian Institute, and the Greens have quoted that figure downhill and down dale, and it's completely discredited. Now, what is not discredited, Madam Acting Deputy President, is that actually the most subsidised sector in our economy is renewable energy. It's renewable energy. It gets enormous amounts of subsidy. And in August this year, a principal economics study found that the renewable energy sector received in 2013-14 subsidies of around $2.8 billion. And these are actual subsidies. These are things like the renewable energy target, which pushes up power prices on poor people to pay for solar panels on the roofs of rich people. It includes feed-in tariffs, which do exactly the same thing. And it includes other green subsidies that we make to the renewable energy sector. Oh, and while $2.8 billion is a lot of money, it's even much, much greater when you take it into the context of what the renewable energy sector actually produces, which is only a small amount of our power needs. So on that basis, on a megawatt per hour basis, the solar sector receives a $412 subsidy, the wind sector $42 per megawatt hour, and other renewable sources $18 a megawatt hour. And I think it's important to compare. In comparison, the coal-fired sector receives less than $1 per megawatt hour, and natural gas receives less than 1 cent per megawatt hour delivered. So the subsidies to solar are almost 500 times as much as mining, and about 48 times higher than wind. But we are here debating a bill seeking to remove a non-existent subsidy on the mining sector while completely ignoring the billions of dollars of subsidies that go to renewable energy. It shows the hypocrisy of the Greens, their lack of engagement in the real policy debate, and this bill should be voted against in this parliament.
Senator Dastyari.